People who have hired other people, what are some unexpected ways a candidate has disqualified themselves from decrease their odds of getting a position they applied for? I had someone come in who had just quit another job. And they badmouthed their previous boss throughout the entire interview. Like, we tried to steer her away and she went back to it. She clearly needed to unload, but an interview is not the place. I was wondering about this. What if they ask you why are you leaving the previous company? How truthful should you be? At the company I am currently working, there has been couple of people who were interviewed and they were talking really bad stuff about their previous companies. Should they have just pretended that everything was fine? You can be honest about crappy previous employment without spending 20 minutes dunking on management. It wasn't a good culture fit or they struggled with communication or whatever. Then move on. Doing a tech screen phone interview. And you could tell the guy was googling his heart out every time we asked a question. He would say, let me think about that for a second. The background ambient noise would cut off. And then cut back on a second later. And he'd start reading off stuff from the top Google result. I had somebody pull this on me once. It was the most obvious thing in the world. There'd be this huge pause before they'd all of a sudden just start rattling all kinds of facts off. If you actually knew the answer to that level of detail, it wouldn't take 15-20 seconds for you to start answering questions. At one point I brought up the Wikipedia page for the subject on my phone while she answered and silently followed along with her as she pretty much read it out to me. This was my first phone interview ever. So my boss was sitting in with me. Afterwards he told me that he nearly closed the interview by saying, well, you have a good Wikipedia level understanding of things, but you're not quite what we're looking for. Double quote. Had a guy who reluctantly told me he used to work at a sex shop to try and save him from feeling weird. I told him that my wife has always found it fascinating and would love to work in one. His response, well, isn't she a f***ing weirdo? If I was the interviewer, I'd have to leave the room, I'd be laughing so hard. I hope there was no pause and he just said it without having to think. That would make it 20 times funnier. I just remembered one more. I had a candidate bring his mother into an interview. As in actually trying to help him answer. I asked her to leave and then told him directly that she is harming his career. He was fresh out of undergraduate. But that's still pretty bad. Close bracket. I interviewed a kid who was 19 and his dad came to the interview. At first I was pretty set on not hiring him solely on the fact that his dad was there. In a position where the kid was going to be working with minimal supervision, janitor, I automatically thought his dad was there to push him to interview. Turns out the kid had a form of Down syndrome that made certain situations like an interview difficult. After I got to talking to him and he became more comfortable with me, the kid went through the interview like a pro. He even had previous experience that he was able to describe pretty well for an interview. I hired him on the spot. In a section of the application where we ask if they have a felony record, they answered yes. In the following field asking about details of said felony they had put they had embezzled funds from their previous employer. Then assaulted that employer. Then assaulted arresting officers. While I admire the honesty, that's gonna be a no from me, dog. I heard about a parent who took their child somewhere to fill out an application. While the kid was filling out the application, the parent struck up a conversation with the manager, saying how their kid is lazy, disrespectful, and never listens, and how they want this job to whip their kid into shape. After they leave, the manager tosses out the kid's application. I owned an IT services company and two candidates have always stood out. Once brought his mom to the interview. He was 23, and she answered the questions. The second had a 2-page resume with one job in his history but spent the rest of the resume talking about his Boy Scout experience and that he was an Eagle Scout. I interviewed him just to see what he would do and sure enough every question I asked was answered with the preface as an Eagle Scout. The dude was 20. I don't f***ing care about you being an Eagle Scout and it doesn't mean anything to me. I've been on several hiring committees, and once we were attempting to hire for a programmer position and one of the candidates was asked something to the tune of, "A user has experienced a bug with some software you've written. How do you handle the situation?" And the candidate answered something along the lines of, "I would take the software back to the vendor and ask them to fix the bug." The obvious answer being, you're the programmer. You document and fix the bug. Overall, it wasn't a nail in the coffin answer, mind you, but adding this candidate's no programming experience and no knowledge of any individual programming language, it was enough to make us pass on this particular person. Parking in a clearly designated reserved spot right in the front of the building. It just shows to me that you don't have any respect for our rules. Going through the weed out process for a county sheriff's department. On the second day we were told, tomorrow morning, go to this other building. Do not under any circumstances park in the first 4 rows of parking spaces. About an hour after the third day began, a female deputy read off a list of about a dozen names and announced, if you recognize a name on that list as yours or the owner of the car you drove, proceed to the front desk to have your car unbooted so that you may leave the premises. Your application has been disqualified for failure to follow very simple instructions. You may reapply in 6 months. It was brutal. I once interviewed a candidate for an accounting position at the non-profit I was working for. It was early in my career and I hadn't conducted many interviews. I'm certain I was more nervous than the candidates. One applicant came in and, after introductions and shaking hands, I offered him a seat and took my own to begin the interview. When I looked up, he was standing at attention. When I asked him to take his seat, he refused and referenced his military service. I tried to press forward and engage in a conversation, but the awkwardness of speaking to a tall person who was standing just a few feet away from me only grew. In the end, I thanked him for his service and eliminated him from my list. I'm not in a position to hire people yet, but got this funny story from my father. Basically, he went out on Friday evening with friends to drink some beers and they got beaten up by some drunken idiots who just look for fights when they are drunk. The next Monday, my father was holding hiring appointments, and the guy who beat him showed up to apply for a position under my father. He didn't get the job. Had a guy bring his 4-year-old to an interview. It was fine until he didn't make him listen. It was the middle of January and the kid continuously opens and closes the door while saying, "Ooh daddy, it's cold outside." I asked him to tell him to stop and he just kinda nodded up to me and let him continue. It got to the point where I had to get up and lock the door. Kid made a huge fuss. Dad completely ignored him. And I got to listen to a screaming kid for the next 10 minutes. No hire. My wife once interviewed a man who refused to speak to women due to religious reasons. This meant he would not speak to her during his interview. She tried to stress to him that she was the manager for the position in question and would be the person conducting the interview. She asked him questions for 10 minutes, none of which he answered. She said it was incredibly uncomfortable. The strange thing was, as he was not a new hire and had like 12 years experience at another company. Not sure how you can make it 12 years when refusing to work with or talk to women. I was teacher and one time I had a parent-teacher conference in which I mentioned that their son seemed to have a hard time following directions. The dad said, basically, that's what he taught his son. That he never has to listen to a woman. They also believed that their daughter's education wasn't important because she was pretty. Refuse to say, I don't know. Usually, our interviews for software engineers are set up to increase the difficulty of questions until it's really unlikely and unexpected that the candidate will be able to answer them. It's entirely expected that, eventually, the candidate will have to say, I don't know the answer to that. From there, we explore how you might find out, etc. This is an important thing to discover about someone because, inevitably in our line of work, something comes up where you don't know the answer and have to figure it out or learn it. If the candidate persists in some kind of smear of bullshit instead of just admitting ignorance, that's a big red flag. Nobody knows everything. And the true judge of a software engineer's competence is how well they learn something new. Not so much what they already know. 2 stories here. While I was a manager of a blockbuster, RIP, I asked an applicant if he had any questions. He looked me dead in the eye and asked, how do you handle people copying the DVDs? Is there a system in place here that can detect it? I was dumbfounded. That was pretty much a dead giveaway why he was there. Later found out that he frequents other rental outlets, rents multiple DVDs at a time and returns them the same day. While I was an AGM for a hotel, I was interviewing a gentleman for a front desk position. He was incredibly calm during the interview and would have been a perfect fit. A while into the interview there was a terrible poo smell. We were the only 2 people in the room, so I knew he was the one that let it slip. No harm done. It happens and I wasn't going to point it out even though it was a terrible smell and you could definitely tell by the look on my face. But he just looks at me and says, do you need to go real quick? He literally blamed me for his fart. Edit for clarification. I saw the guy do the little side lean but thought nothing of it at the time. We had a guy come in for an interview, and he showed up a full 40 minutes prior to his scheduled interview. 1 room office shared by 3 people, so there's no good place for him to wait. I said, you can go to the coffee shop next door and come back at the scheduled time. He said, no, I'll just wait here, I have a phone call to make. He proceeds to have a very loud phone conversation in our 1 room office. When it was finally time for his scheduled interview, he was still on the phone, and actually shushed me and said, I'm on the phone. 10 minutes later he was ready to be interviewed. Not even sure why we proceeded with the interview, but it was over quickly and his resume was in the recycle before the door even closed. I'm a lobby guard, so I don't do the interviews. However, I have had interviewers ask me how the interviewee behaved in the lobby while waiting. Most just sit there twiddling their thumbs nervously. But 9/10 times those who ask me questions about the company and or the team they are interviewing for are hired. And 10/10 times people who are genuinely rude to me are never hired. I would have thought that this is common knowledge. Why on earth would you be rude to literally anyone where you're interviewing for a job? Assume that you're making an impression on everyone. Seriously. When I'm heading to an interview, I'm sweet as pie to everyone I encounter on the way, even if I'm miles away from the office location. Not only is there a chance, however minuscule, I might encounter someone who works at the same place, I also don't want to start the interview with any negative energy. Candidate arrived in rollerblades. Stayed in rollerblades the whole interview. He used the word blade instead of walk or go for the whole interview. Can't tell if I was being punked. Some more details. He was in his early 20s. Resume was good but not great. The whole rollerblades thing wasn't a deal breaker, but it definitely didn't help. He insisted on sitting on the desk rather than on a seat, so his rollerblade feet could just hang. I had to insist a couple more times throughout the interview for him to reluctantly take a seat, which didn't help either. I work at a hospital on a med-surg floor. We have a 2-part interview, one with the unit manager and one with either a nurse or an aide. We have a series of questions to ask based on a survey they fill out on the end of the application. She managed to make her way to me and this was her response to a question. If you saw a co-worker doing something unethical, like stealing from a patient, what would you do? It depends if it was valuable or not. I mean, who hasn't stolen something before? I had to take a personality test for a retail job once. The test was all questions like agree or disagree. It's okay to take money out of the till sometimes. Or everyone steals from the register from time to time. At first, I was all, hell no, that's stealing. But by the end of the questionnaire I thought maybe it was much more widely accepted than I thought. Was returning after lunch. Had my usual space cut off right in front of me by a very rude gent who told me to go park with the secretarial pool where I belonged. I brushed it off, parked elsewhere and went to my office. 10 minutes later the same gent walks in. I was the senior director interviewing him for a manager position. Talking about how he had pirated our games in the F-King interview. It could impress the interviewer if done with tact. When I was 10, my parents refused to buy me any games. So I learned how to use emulators and downloaded Super Mario 3. I was mesmerized by the game and found ways to speedrun it. My record is 21 minutes. Not the best, but pretty good I'd imagine. Anyway, once I was old enough to get a job, I stopped pirating and bought every Mario game that came out. And even have an original still in the box copy of Mario 3 now. So yeah, you could say I love Nintendo. Double quote. I said this on a Till post yesterday, but it was really an answer to this question, so here ya go. My dad was interviewing someone at a restaurant for a leadership position at his consulting firm. The restaurant brought over to-go boxes for them to box up their food. And the guy goes, "What, we have to box it up ourselves? PSHHH. Double quote. Instant disqualification. The expectation that you wouldn't have to do such a simple task yourself. And the arrogant reaction of almost disgust was plenty to disqualify him from the leadership position. Not the sort of helpful, go-getter, I can do that attitude needed in a professional consulting role. I heard some responses to this on my last post which made good points. Some were that some people have never had a restaurant let you box the food up yourself. And others just preferred the restaurant do it for them. Personally, I think it's okay to be surprised that a restaurant asks you to do it yourself when you've never seen that before. But you have to approach the new situation with humility and grace. Not disgust and arrogance. People that follow up too aggressively. I want people to be excited about positions. But I do not want people who call or follow up daily. These things take some time. So be respectful of the hiring manager. 1 or 2 follow-ups via email or quick conversations are great. But calling us 5 times in a week will get you a quick no regardless of your qualifications. When I was looking for my first job, my mom insisted that I should call frequently to remind them of my application. She said it showed I was interested in and dedicated to getting the job. I never did though because it was for retail shit and I don't like talking on the phone. Maybe it's a cultural thing for older folks. My grandma insisted I do it too. Gonna say something about myself here. My first job interview ever. I'm a grade 11. I think a junior is what it's called in the US. So this was only about half a year ago. So there's this job fair for a Harvey's, like Subway with burgers, opening soon. I make a resume and sit down with my interviewer. I'm clearly nervous and most of my answers are quiet and not that good. But the zinger is when he asks me the question, if you could be a burger topping, which one would you be? Double quote. I was completely floored and found myself unable to speak for the most awkward 60 seconds of my life as I desperately try to muster up an answer. After shifting around in my chair for a solid minute, I spew the word tomato and nothing else. He just looked at me for a few seconds before continuing without a word of acknowledgement. I never heard back from them.